Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is Cisco CCNA Exam 200-301. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at an overview of networking components. And here to help us is the Mr. Ronnie Wong. How are you doing today, sir?
I am doing well, Vaughn. Thank you again for joining us as we continue to actually take a look. But Vaughn, yes, we're taking a look at a very interesting subject at this point, where we're going to be talking about, well, networking components. And what we want to do, of course, is to understand that some of us may have actually been working in the field before, but some of us haven't. We expect, of course, that you've already have the prerequisite knowledge. But just in case you don't, right, we're going to do just a short little overview of the idea of different networking components, especially explaining the idea of the roles and functions and, of course, where they appear. So, Vaughn, does that sound like fun?
I think that sounds fantastic. And I'm assuming you have a wonderful visual aid for us, don't you?
I do. So that way it actually helps us to accomplish a couple of different things as we begin. So let's take a look at my screen as we jump right into this and start talking about the idea of different networking components. So, Vaughn, when we first start talking about the idea of networking components, we want to make sure that we understand that it's not just one device that counts as the entire network itself, but it is a whole, a whole bunch of many different devices. I want to say a symphony of devices, but that's not exactly quite the greatest analogy in the world. But it's a whole bunch of different devices that are connecting together somehow in some way that make up the entirety of networks that we have. And all of them, of course, function so that we can get the communication that we need. So, Vaughn, when we start talking about the idea of networking components, it always has to begin with the idea of a need that we have. So usually we are on some type of device, and let me zoom in so that I can kind of point out what I want to. So let's say, for example, of course, today we're on a workstation at work, or we have a laptop and we're connecting in wirelessly however we want to. But Vaughn, the whole goal behind connecting to a network, of course, is so that I can connect and get the resources that I need and get that information back to me. Without this type of connection on a network, Vaughn, the way that we would do network traditionally, of course, is what we call the old idea of sneakernet. So, Vaughn, have you ever used a USB key to transfer files from, let's say, your laptop to a desktop computer before?
I have, and I do remember the first time I heard sneakernet, I'm like, I don't know of this. I know the internet and I know intranets. I'm like, sneakernet, that must be some like proprietary thing. You mean using your shoes and you walking over to somebody else's desk and handing them a file or a USB key and saying, here, I need to go ahead and send you this file.
Right.
Yeah.
So at the very beginning, we start thinking about components, and the basic idea of the network there is really fairly simple to do that, right? A USB key goes into your laptop. You copy the files on that. You take it over to a workstation that you have there, and Vaughn, we've just done networking, okay? Now, Vaughn, in that sense, is limited, okay? So in that limitation of things, it means that I can only get information from one device to another. Now, we can continue to transfer that over to another workstation if we need to, whatever we actually want to do. But when we start thinking about it, Vaughn, we want this to be much more efficient, because if not, we have to do this for every single person inside of our network. So instead, what we can do is we can link up multiple pieces of components, okay, or equipment that allow us to form what we call a network that can provide for us that connectivity and the same functionality as well. So each one of the components that we see right here, Vaughn, has a particular role and function, and we're going to be diving into those a bit, more in depth as we move through this kind of little mini series here on networking component. But at the beginning, Vaughn, what we want to do is have a big kind of 10,000-foot overview and understand the layout and topology of most typical small to medium networks. Now, I'm not actually going into large, gigantic, super-sized networks here, but something that most of us are going to be fairly familiar with as we start doing this. So, Vaughn, I always began from right here because that's where I began to understand the idea, the need for networking, is when I had to do something like sneakernet. Well, Vaughn, if I now hook in 50 or 60 different people, well, now that sneakernet begins to slow down quite a bit, okay? It not only slows down, but it becomes clunky, okay? People don't do it exactly the same way. Sometimes people put the USB key in and then they rip it out without actually safely ejecting. Now, in today's world, in theory, we don't have to worry about that anymore, but in the older models, you used to have to worry about file transfers and stuff that would actually get corrupted. So in the idea of networking, this allows us to actually have devices essentially planted inside of our network. We, of course, are connected together using some type of cabling. And once we do that, we now establish that same functionality of something like SneakerNet without actually needing something like a USB key or a floppy disk or anything like that. Okay. So Vaughn, where we are going to begin is we want to make sure that we understand some of the most basic networking components that are out there that make up essentially a network. Okay. So Vaughn, I talked about the idea of workstations and laptops. Today, they even include things like tablet devices, iPads, iPad Pros, whatever Surface tablet that you may have. Smartphones are also included in this, Vaughn. Now, when I first started, Vaughn, when we started doing this included the realm of what we call PDAs, of course, but today, those are usually the types of devices that we have.
And it could be something as simple as a printer, too.
Right.
Like that would be a device that it's like an endpoint.
Right.
Okay, and we're starting kind of like when I actually talk about doing freelance designing backwards.
Right.
Okay, where do I want to go? And then once I know where I need to go, then I can go backwards and design from the front.
Yeah, that's actually a great point to make, Vaughn. The overall idea is that we want to begin with that understanding of what we call an endpoint. So what is the idea of the function of the endpoint? And we'll talk about this much more in depth a little bit later on.
Yeah, and it could be, depending on the size of your network, how many endpoints do I have? Because that might determine how many other pieces in the middle that you would need, depending on, do I have 10 devices or do I have 10,000 devices?
That's right, Vaughn. The very fact is that it does help to determine the idea of sizing and design, because if we have too many endpoints that actually overload a particular other device, well, then it can't function as efficiently as we need to. So endpoints are essentially critical for us. And endpoints can actually be done not only in the terms of what an end user actually has, but when we start thinking about endpoints, think about it in this way, right? It's normally actually going to be the one that requests some type of information, in other words, is trying to retrieve information, or it's going to be the destination of the information as well, okay? So either it's the one that's actually saying, hey, send me information, or it actually can be the source of information too. Now, when I say that as well, Vaughn, we not only talk about things like end user devices, but we can also talk about things like servers too, okay? So if we take a look at my diagram again, we'll see up here on this side, I have things like file servers, storage servers, email servers, stuff like that. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more in depth later on. And even access points to a point are fairly endpoints as well. So you can actually see stuff like this too. But tablets, servers, essentially even hardware servers, sometimes even software servers, workstations that include operating systems, laptops, and they even virtualize types of machines like this. They are examples of endpoints for us too. Now, Vaughn, let's stick to the idea of closer to the endpoint as we can. And the next one that we think about is not only the cabling that leads on to the next layer, but we can talk about the wireless devices. So here, Vaughn, on my diagram, I have the idea of what we call a WLC and also an access point as well. And this is where we get into the realm of different things, right? Access points essentially become the same thing as physical cables do, but for wireless devices. So this actually is just an extension of this cable going out to this laptop. So this is not really another device that we have to really worry about in terms of actually making another separate device, but it's there. But this is the one that we want to talk about right here, which is what we call the realm of a controller, okay? So Vaughn, WLC stands for wireless LAN controller, okay, is what it actually stands for. And this particular type of device, we don't necessarily need in every single network, but we might need them because of what it actually allows us to do, okay? So in both the networks that I have drawn here on this particular diagram, what you see is a wireless LAN controller and then access points. Most wireless LAN controllers, what they're actually good at doing, of course, is configuring and managing multiple access points. Now, Vaughn, if I have a single access point like in a small office, home office network, I don't need anything like this because it's really one device and I'm the one that's actually in control of that thing. But when I have a lot of them, let's say 50 or 60 of them, and I don't want to reconfigure every single one by hand, a wireless LAN controller allows me to do one place, and then I can actually push that configuration out.
Yeah, because I know a little bit of that stuff, and I was like, WLC, that's actually one I'm not as familiar, and I've been on quite a few of your shows and other people's shows. So wireless controls other access points.
Right, yeah, controls other access points, and we can even have other different types of controllers. And I didn't add this one in here. The reason why, Vaughn, is that when we start to talk about the realm of controllers, this has actually moved even outside of our particular topology that we have right here into the realm of the cloud, where we can talk about things that are actually, network controllers that are out there. Network controllers allow us to go just beyond the idea of wireless devices and be able to actually control, well, multiple networking devices that are out there, regardless of whether they're wired or wireless as well. So in Cisco land, they talk about the Cisco DNA Center, the digital network administrator that's actually out there, or access. I can't remember the actual terminology right now off the top of my head, but it is another type of controller that's out there, but it's also a cloud-based type of device for us instead of actually a device or an appliance type of basis instead. So in that sense, controllers are out there as well, and that can also be a part of our network that helps us to do configuration and management. And the idea there is what we call intent-based networking, which again we'll jump into when we get into this the Cisco DNA, data network, digital networking architecture. That's what it stands for in that sense. So we'll actually talk about that as well. So Vaughn, next, as we start moving more towards the edge of our network out here towards the internet, we want to make sure that we understand that there are what we call switches. Okay. So Vaughn, when we get into the realm of switches here, okay, I have two different switches that you can see. There's actually what we call layer 3 switches and layer 2 switches as well. Okay. So I actually drew both of them just as an example of what can be done here. Okay. So a layer 2 switch provides for us just basic connectivity between our devices. Serves as a centralized connectivity point within LANs, local area networks, the majority of the time, and we don't necessarily have to do much with them unless we really need some control. Most of the switches from Cisco right out of the box, as soon as you plug power in them, they are off and they are ready to go. Doesn't mean that you should actually just put them into a production network that way, but it means that they are functional and that they're ready to go right out of the box. Layer 3 switches, though, also include in a bit of the routing capacity that we can actually find, or the functionality that we can find in a regular standardized router as well. It doesn't give us every feature of routing that's out there, but enough to actually make it do what we call layer 3 routing. So Vaughn, this is fairly useful because what we used to have to do when we had to kind of separate out VLANs within a single switch, okay? So now we actually were able to subdivide out our switches and carve them into multiple subnets. Well, it used to be where you had to go all the way out to the router and then route it back down into the VLAN, into another VLAN, even if they existed on the same switch.
These layer 2 and layer 3, is this like the ISO model? Is that like?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we're talking about layer 2 with like the network, the NIC cards.
Yep,
Right,
that's it.
and then layer 3 is networking.
Yep,
right?
that's
Yes.
it. Yep, networking and data link layer. Very
Whew,
good, Vaughn.
Man, I'm remembering
So there you
this.
go. Yeah,
I
that's
actually had to Google what that
Oh.
thing was. You know that the 7 things was
Yeah.
all people seem to need delicious pizza.
yeah.
We had
This
an
is the
acronym,
the
remember?
OSI model. That's right.
OSI model,
Yeah,
yes.
the OSI model. So for us here, Vaughn, it's the same thing. But when I was talking about the idea of VLANs, right? The very fact is, if I create a VLAN on a layer 3 switch, I no longer have to get a router, a separate router involved anymore. I can now route between different VLANs within the switch because the routing functionality is built in right here. Now, can it really function as a regular router? Well, to a point, it can actually give us routing functions that we need, but it can't really do all the other things that a router can actually do on its own. So Vaughn, we do have the ideas here that we want to take a look. And most of the time today, layer 3 switches are where we tend to see a lot of the devices that we have in our networks today as well. Okay, so I'm not saying layer 2 switches aren't out there and available, but these are not as functionally
Robust?
robust, or I shouldn't say robust, but as expansive in their capabilities as a layer 3 switch. Layer 3 offers us layer 2 and layer 3 capabilities, whereas the layer 2 switch really operates at layer 2. Okay, so that's pretty much the idea. Now, Vaughn, once we get in that, we can now go into the realm of, well, different devices that are out there that help provide what we call security too. Okay, so Vaughn, for us, most of the idea of security, and notice where they actually reside, closest to the internet right here. Notice that the rest of our LAN is actually behind them, and that means any internet traffic, they would have to go between what we call an NGFW, which is a next generation firewall, or a firewall. Now today, the difference between these are how they actually function and work and what they function based off of as well. So firewalls are general packet inspection, okay? They provide for us session-based filtering, and that means that as long as data is coming from the inside, going to the outside, that data will be allowed to come back in and through. Any data originating from the outside, trying to come in, and it's not actually been not been requested from the internal side of the network, that will get dropped, okay, right away. Okay, so it has this built-in functionality in that. But Vaughn, this type of inspection itself is really based on a lot of rules that are essentially on the firewall itself, And Vaughn, those rules also need to be updated quite regularly if we actually keep everything up to date and do what we need to do. We have to worry about these types of devices, make sure that we can keep them as secure as possible by updating them, making sure that happens. The next generation firewall takes care of all that for us. The reason why it does this, Vaughn, is because it actually taps into a subscription type of service. We still buy the same type of appliance, but this time in the next generation firewall, it offers us both the ability to do intrusion prevention as well as the firewall capabilities as well, all in one device. And it is now informed by a global intelligence, security intelligence network that's out there. In Cisco land, we call that intelligence network Talos, Talos. And they're one of the most fantastic security services that are out there that help to ensure that these devices not only get the latest updates, but that inside of whatever cloud structure that's out there, that they can also update, but they can also make sure that we can prevent even any type of malware and anything else that's coming in before it even happens as many times. And then your device is just there making sure it functions too, okay? All right, so Vaughn, those are the ones, and like I said, we'll dive in this. We'll even show examples of this as we can. And lastly, Vaughn, the idea of the router. Now, the router for us provides for us connectivity, as you see right here, Vaughn, between essentially the internet, okay, and the rest of our networking devices that we have, okay? So all that's actually right there when we start talking about the idea of the different devices that are actually in hand for us, okay? So Vaughn, when we first actually start to do this, it allows us to ensure that any traffic that's coming in, the router can route it to one network or it can route it to another network. Now, Vaughn, even more importantly, for most of us that are sitting here at the endpoint workstations, is Vaughn, it means that my own workstation doesn't have to go out there and discover every single network that's out there that I want to communicate with. And what I mean by that, Vaughn, let's say, for example, if you've never been to IT Pro TV before, and you've never been to other favorite websites that you had, your workstation would have to actually figure out the routes to every single one of those things. Well, Vaughn, inside behind the router, I don't have to do that anymore. When I actually need to send something out, I send it out from my machine, and it says inside of my network here, it's not in my routing table, then we can actually have a default route that says send it out that way, okay? And that way, the router itself can handle the routing process for us. So Vaughn, this is the device that really allows us to get and to actually be able to send between different networks, and especially across the internet today. So when we see a layout like this, Vaughn, this is kind of a more traditional small to medium-sized network where we tend to have a router at the edge connecting into our ISP somewhere along here, which then connects us to the internet. But then we filter that out by using different firewalls, okay, or next-generation firewall devices to help us to filter the traffic down to allow only what we want. And then that connectivity can be spread through our layer 2 or layer 3 switches, and of course, either directly cabled or using wireless all the way out to the endpoint devices. So Vaughn, that is our basic overview of some of the different components. Now, if any of this sounds challenging to you, okay, my recommendation, right, is that you go back and you take a look at maybe the idea of the CompTIA Network Plus, or inside of our own course library, it may be in the legacy library by the time you view this. You may also see the CCENT course that's also out there as well. Make sure you review these concepts more in depth. We're continuing on with the new CCNA at this point, and that means we're actually not going to be spending a ton of focus on this, but this was just a great primer. So Vaughn, in the next few episodes that we'll be doing, we'll be diving into some of these different components here, make sure that we actually do discuss the roles and the functions of all these different components at a little bit more in-depth level as we continue through. But Vaughn, that should do it for this episode and gives us a little bit of a great place to start.
All right, well, that was a great review for me because like I said, I knew a little bit of this, but it's always nice to kind of get your bearings when we're starting a new series and know where we're going. And I learned about a wireless LAN controller. All right, new acronym for me and a new term. So thank you, Ronnie. Thank you all out there for watching, but we're going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.